She never expected a job interview to uncover a medical secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her life. Sitting in a bright, sterile office, she smiled politely as the recruiter explained the final steps in the hiring process. It was a routine health screening, something she barely paid attention to, something she'd done a dozen times before. She gave blood, answered the standard questions, filled out the forms. Then, 2 days later, she received a call from the company's medical partner asking her to come in to discuss the results. It didn't sound urgent, but there was something in the nurse's voice, a tension, that lingered in her thoughts. When she arrived, the doctor was waiting with a serious expression. He told her that something strange had shown up on the scans. Confused, she listened as he said, in clinical terms, that her body showed the clear signs of a nephrectomy. She had one kidney. Just one. The other had been surgically removed. Her heart raced. There had to be a mistake. She had never undergone any major surgery. She would have remembered something like that. Wouldn't she? She denied everything. She shook her head, insisting there was no way the information could be correct. The doctor pulled out the files, documents signed under her name, using her insurance, the procedure logged 3 years prior. There was a signature, her signature. But she knew she never signed it. She could barely breathe as she stared at the unfamiliar handwriting that bore her name. Her mind spiraled. 3 years ago. What happened 3 years ago? She remembered collapsing at home. She remembered Daniel, her husband, helping her to bed. She had thought she'd simply overworked herself. He told her she'd had a reaction to stress. He gave her tea. He kept her in bed. She hadn't questioned it then. Now, it felt like a dark cloud was lifting, revealing something sickening underneath. She left the clinic in a daze, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The pieces didn't fit, until they did. And when they did, everything changed. Because when she confronted her husband, he didn't argue. He didn't cry. He didn't try to deny it. He simply looked at her, quiet and cold, and said she wasn't supposed to find out. That was the moment the illusion shattered. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a life with had taken something from her without her knowledge, without her consent. And suddenly, her entire marriage, her entire reality, twisted into a horrifying truth. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. At first, everything about their life together seemed beautiful, it was permanent, almost cinematic in its perfection. It had been hidden in plain sight. They met in college, both of them ambitious, driven, and full of plans for the future. She was the kind of woman who always arrived early to class, who color-coded her notes, who volunteered for extra credit not because she needed it but because she thrived on control and structure. He, on the other hand, was charismatic in a quiet, grounding way, someone who never competed for attention but always seemed to have the room's respect. People said they balanced each other. She brought order, he brought calm. She brought vision, he brought support. It felt right from the very beginning, as if 2 puzzle pieces had finally clicked into place. They dated for 3 years before getting married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and family. There were no fireworks, no over-the-top declarations, just a deep, reassuring certainty that they belonged together. They moved into a modest apartment downtown. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, old fixtures, squeaky floorboards, but it was theirs. They decorated it slowly, with mismatched furniture from thrift stores and weekend flea markets, laughing over every odd find that somehow found its place. Their days were simple and warm. He made coffee every morning before she got out of bed, often with a note waiting on the counter. She worked long hours at a growing HR firm, throwing herself into projects with the kind of focus that left her exhausted but fulfilled. He worked freelance from home, picking up web design jobs and cooking elaborate dinners as a way to unwind. On weekends, they took long walks through the city, stopping for street food or exploring quiet corners of local bookstores. They talked about the future the way young couples do, casually but with intent. Maybe a house in the suburbs. Maybe a child or two. She wasn't in a rush, and he seemed perfectly content to let her career lead the way. He always told her how proud he was of her ambition, how impressed he was by her discipline. She believed him. There was no reason not to. He never raised his voice. He never disappeared without explanation. He didn't drink excessively, didn't gamble, didn't flirt with other women. To the outside world, and even to her own careful eyes, he was a good man. Reliable. Loving. Present. There were rituals that became the background music of their life together. Sunday morning spent reading in silence. Late-night documentaries under a shared blanket. Grocery shopping together even when it wasn't necessary. They celebrated small victories with takeout and lit candles just because. She often thought to herself how lucky she was to have found someone so steady, someone who made the world feel less sharp. She didn't see the slow, creeping signs of imbalance. He had a way of making her believe he was always putting her first. When she came home tired and irritable, he would rub her shoulders and listen without interrupting. When she doubted herself, he would reassure her with soft, careful words that always seemed to say exactly what she needed to hear. And yet, there were things she didn't notice, small decisions he made that removed her from parts of their shared life. He handled all their health insurance paperwork, saying it was easier since he worked from home. He was the one who scheduled her dentist appointments, filled out her medical questionnaires when she was running late. It seemed thoughtful, even romantic. She would smile and thank him, grateful to have someone so attentive. She didn't realize, then, that this attentiveness wasn't selfless. It was strategic. They lived like that for almost 5 years. She rose steadily through the ranks at her company, receiving praise from supervisors and respect from colleagues. Her job demanded more from her, longer hours, weekend meetings, constant travel, but he never complained. He supported her goals with quiet consistency. He said he loved seeing her succeed. When she started talking about buying a house, he agreed immediately. He said they'd make it work. She took on the budgeting and planning, trusting that he'd be her partner through the process. Their sex life had slowed, but she chalked it up to stress. They still held hands. They still kissed goodnight. It wasn't fiery, but it was comfortable. Safe. Trustworthy. She had no suspicions, no fears, no warning bells in her mind. He made her tea when she had a cold, ordered her favorite takeout when she had bad days. She thought he was perfect. He made her feel cared for, protected, valued. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, was that behind the curtain of domestic bliss, something darker was unfolding. He was watching her closely, always taking mental notes. He knew her routines better than she did. He knew when she'd be too tired to question things, when she skipped reading documents, when she trusted his judgment over her own. And over time, he learned exactly how far he could stretch that trust without breaking it. Every detail of their life together was built on a foundation of quiet manipulation disguised as love. He wasn't violent, and he wasn't loud, but he was deliberate. And in that deliberate silence, in those small choices made without her input, he laid the groundwork for a betrayal that would one day leave her questioning everything. But for now, in those early years, she felt like she was living in a dream. She believed in the life they'd built. She believed in him. There were no red flags, no dark secrets, only the comforting rhythm of two people who, from the outside, seemed to have figured it all out. The world saw them and smiled. And she smiled with it, unaware that beneath the surface of her perfect life, a quiet storm was already gathering strength. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind of day she barely remembered a week later. The sun filtered in through their half-drawn curtains, and the apartment smelled faintly of toasted bread and citrus cleaner. She had a presentation that morning, a quarterly performance review she'd spent days preparing. Her suit was pressed, her notes were highlighted, her heels clicked confidently against the wooden floor. Nothing felt wrong, not at first. There had been no pain, no warning signs that morning. Just a slight headache she dismissed with a sip of coffee and a rushed goodbye kiss on her way out the door. The building's conference room was cool and humming with anticipation. She stood at the front, laser pointer in hand, delivering results to a room full of executives. Her voice was steady. Her points were sharp. She was in control, until she wasn't. Midway through a slide transition, her fingers trembled. Her throat tightened. She blinked, once, twice, and then everything dimmed. It wasn't dramatic like in movies, no sudden gasp, no shattering glass, just a slow, sinking blackness, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. She collapsed where she stood. When she opened her eyes, her coworkers were crouched over her, panic painted on their faces, and someone was calling her name over and over. At the hospital, tests were run, blood drawn, scans taken. Hours passed in a blur. By the time her husband arrived, she was sitting upright in bed, the color still not fully returned to her face. The doctors hadn't found anything concrete. They suspected stress, overwork, maybe dehydration. She hadn't eaten that morning. She had barely slept the night before. She nodded along. It made sense. She worked too hard. She pushed herself too far. And the truth was, she didn't want to believe anything more serious might be wrong. She was young, healthy, disciplined. Her body just needed rest. Over the next few weeks, she resumed life almost as usual, though with subtle differences. There were more headaches now, a persistent fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. Her skin looked duller in the mirror, her under eyes darker. But she chalked it up to seasonal changes, poor diet, a demanding project at work. Whenever she mentioned her fatigue to her husband, he'd bring her vitamins, make her smoothies, insist on more home-cooked meals. He was gentle, supportive, attentive. He told her she needed to slow down, to stop trying to be perfect all the time. She agreed, or at least pretended to. But inside, something didn't feel quite right. Sometimes, she would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing and no idea why. Other times, she felt dizzy climbing the stairs, needing to pause halfway, something she never had to do before. Her body, once strong and responsive, felt sluggish. Her workouts suffered. She couldn't run more than 5 minutes without losing her breath. One day she felt a sharp pain in her lower back, a searing twist that made her double over in the grocery store. It passed quickly, and she told herself it was a pulled muscle or a pinched nerve. She took ibuprofen, used a heating pad, and moved on. But moments like that kept stacking up, little whispers from her body that something wasn't right. Despite all this, she didn't go back to the hospital. Not yet. Part of her feared the answer, and part of her trusted the comfort of her husband's explanations. He reassured her again and again. He said it was all just a byproduct of stress. She had always been high-strung, always overcommit. Maybe her body was just finally saying no. And he made sure she didn't feel crazy for feeling off. That was the part that kept her from digging deeper, his calmness, his constant presence. He seemed so sure that nothing was wrong. And he took such good care of her. He reminded her to take her supplements. He booked her massage appointments. He took over grocery shopping and meal prep. She told herself it was lucky to have a husband like that. Months passed. Seasons shifted. She had more faint spells, not full collapses but sudden waves of lightheadedness that came at odd times, stepping out of the shower, walking down the sidewalk, sitting at her desk. Each one passed quickly, but they left behind a trail of confusion. Her memory became patchy in strange ways. She forgot where she parked, misplaced her keys more often, sometimes blanked out mid-sentence and had to restart her train of thought. She Googled symptoms late at night and convinced herself it was anemia or burnout or vitamin deficiency. All treatable. All fixable. Nothing life-threatening. Her husband never seemed alarmed. When she expressed worry, he always responded with a soothing kind of logic. He reminded her she hadn't taken a real vacation in over 2 years. He encouraged her to work remotely more often, to nap in the afternoons if she needed. He bought a diffuser with lavender oil and told her it would help with sleep. Everything he did made it harder for her to believe that anything sinister could be happening. He was too kind, too thoughtful. And she was too tired to fight the story that everything was fine. Then came the morning she woke up disoriented, not knowing what day it was. The alarm clock flashed 9:12 a.m. She had missed an important client meeting. Her phone was off. Her calendar had been cleared. She stormed into the kitchen in a daze, demanding to know why he hadn't woken her. He said Shed looked so exhausted, he decided to let her sleep. He thought she needed the rest more than the meeting. She stared at him in disbelief, heart pounding. It was a strange boundary to cross, even for someone so caring. But then he made her coffee, kissed her forehead, and reminded her that she could reschedule. He said the world wouldn't end. And for a moment, she believed him. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She wandered into the bathroom, stared at herself in the mirror. There was a small scar just above her right hip bone. It was faint, barely visible. She had noticed it before but never questioned it. She always assumed it was from a childhood accident or maybe a mole removal she had forgotten. But suddenly, it looked sharper, more deliberate. She touched it gently, a chill crawling up her spine. She went back to bed and lay next to him in silence, her mind turning over and over the same questions. Something was wrong with her body. And someone was trying very hard to make sure she didn't realize it. Still, she didn't act. She rationalized. She compartmentalized. She told herself she was imagining things. But the truth was already starting to leak through the cracks. Her body was speaking louder than her denial. And though she didn't know it yet, started with the answers she feared most were already buried in her own medical history. Late one night, scrolling aimlessly under a carefully constructed another exhausting day, she stumbled across an opening at a prestigious consulting firm. Not yet. It was the kind of opportunity people usually waited years to be considered for: better pay, flexible hours, meaningful projects, and a reputation for valuing its employees. She bookmarked it almost instinctively, not expecting much. But something about the description made her pause. It felt like the next logical step, a way to break free from the burnout that had become her default state. On a whim, she sent in her resume the next day, polished and packed with her accomplishments. A week later, they called her for an interview. She didn't tell her husband right away. Part of her wanted it to be a quiet victory, something she could hold close before anyone else knew. Part of her, though she couldn't quite admit it, wanted to see how it felt to move without his involvement. Just for once. The interview went well, better than she expected. The hiring manager smiled throughout, nodded at her answers, made notes on her leadership experience. As they wrapped up, he told her she was a strong candidate, but there would be a final screening step, a full physical exam through their partnered health provider. It was standard protocol for senior positions, he said, nothing to worry about. She agreed without hesitation. She'd done this before. It was routine. A few days later, she found herself in a quiet, modern clinic uptown. The waiting room smelled like lemon disinfectant and expensive hand cream. She filled out forms, nodded politely, and followed the nurse down a hallway to a clean white room. They took her vitals, drew blood, ran some basic cognitive and physical assessments. She felt slightly self-conscious about how winded she got during the treadmill test but brushed it off. As always, she minimized her symptoms. She didn't mention the fainting, the chronic fatigue, or the strange bouts of dizziness. She wanted the job, not a list of follow-up appointments. Besides, she'd always considered herself healthy, just a little overworked. 2 days passed in silence. She was in the middle of preparing a client report when the call came. The voice on the other end was warm but formal, the kind that tries to soften bad news before delivering it. They asked her to come back in. There were a few irregularities in her blood work. Nothing alarming, they said, just something to clarify. Her stomach turned, but she kept her voice calm, thanked them for their diligence, and scheduled the soonest appointment available. That night, she felt a heaviness in her chest that wouldn't go away. She didn't sleep. Back at the clinic, she was ushered into a small consultation room. The same doctor from before entered, clipboard in hand. He greeted her with that same clinical smile, but his eyes didn't quite match it. He asked a few questions. Had she donated an organ? Had she undergone any abdominal surgery in the last 5 years? She furrowed her brow. No. Never. He flipped through the chart, nodded slowly, then turned the monitor toward her. On the screen was a recent scan, her scan, and it showed something she didn't understand at first. Then he pointed. She only had 1 kidney. The other had been surgically removed. Time seemed to stretch thin in that moment, as if reality had folded in on itself. She blinked at the image, then at the doctor, trying to find words. He showed her documents. There was a file under her name, a surgery dated 3 years ago, processed through her health insurance, with a scanned consent form bearing her signature. She stared at the lines on the paper, the unmistakable arc of her name, and felt her hands go cold. She had no memory of this. No recollection of any hospital stay, of post-op recovery, of anything that would explain this. Her first instinct was denial. It had to be a clerical error. Maybe someone with the same name. Maybe insurance fraud. But the documents included her ID number, her address, her signature. It was all there. She sat in silence, staring down at proof of something she had no memory of consenting to. Every moment of discomfort over the last 3 years flashed through her mind. The unexplained fatigue, the dizziness, the fainting, the scar on her side she had always ignored. They weren't random. They weren't harmless. Her body had been trying to tell her the truth. In the days that followed, she moved through life in a fog. She kept the test results to herself, unsure of how to even begin explaining them. Her mind kept circling back to one person, her husband. He had been there during that time. He had cared for her when she was too weak to move. He had always handled the insurance, the appointments, the forms. She had trusted him with everything. But now that trust felt fragile, like a surface stretched too thin, ready to tear. She started to remember moments that hadn't made sense back then, strange clinic visits she hadn't asked for, pills he gave her without clear explanations, the day she woke up groggy and confused after what he said was a routine test. She began searching through the apartment, not quite sure what she was hoping to find. The drawers where he kept their paperwork were meticulously organized. Bills, receipts, tax documents. But then, behind a stack of utility statements, she found a thin folder labeled with her full name. Inside were copies of the surgery forms. Original scans. Handwritten notes in her husband's handwriting. Appointment confirmations. Her breath caught. The more she read, the more the pieces came together. The procedure had been scheduled under his coordination. The surgeon's contact info was scribbled in his notebook. A post-op care plan included instructions for sedation and controlled recovery time. It was planned. Hidden. Managed. She closed the folder and sat on the floor, the papers spread around her like debris after a storm. Every instinct told her to confront him, to demand answers. But beneath the shock, another feeling was rising, fear. Not of violence, but of the depth of the betrayal. He hadn't just lied. He had made a medical decision for her body without her knowledge. He had authorized an irreversible procedure and covered it up with years of false comfort. She didn't know who he was anymore. She didn't know if she ever had. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from him, just a simple question, asking if she needed anything from the store. She stared at the screen, her hands still shaking, and realized something terrifying. He thought she would never find out. He thought the secret was buried deep enough that it would never surface. And now that it had, she couldn't go back to the life she had before. The illusion was broken. The questions were too loud to ignore. The man she loved had stolen something from her. And now she was left with the pieces of a truth she never asked for. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for nearly 30 minutes before she could bring herself to go inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind replaying the scan, the signature, the cold matter-of-fact tone of the clinic doctor who had revealed the truth. She had only one kidney. Someone had taken the other. And every lead, every trail, every document pointed back to this hospital. Not a distant, faceless facility, this one. The one she had passed 100 times on her commute, the one where her husband once drove her for a supposed checkup when she had been too drowsy to argue. Now, it loomed in front of her like a monument to a betrayal she couldn't yet fully process. Inside, the lobby was sterile, calm, with polished floors and an artificial sense of order. She asked to speak with someone from records. The receptionist offered her a plastic smile and asked for her ID. A few keystrokes later, the woman nodded, printed out a form, and directed her to the third floor, medical records and archives. The elevator ride was slow. Every floor dinged like a countdown. She felt eyes on her, though no one said a word. When she reached the window, a man in a pale blue shirt asked what she needed. She requested a full patient history under her name from the last 5 years. There was a moment of hesitation, a subtle glance down at the computer screen, and then he nodded. It took over an hour to compile the files. She sat in a corner chair, scrolling through her phone without seeing anything on the screen. When the folder was handed to her, thick, over an inch of paper, she felt a twist of nausea. She walked down the hall to a quiet waiting area and opened it, one page at a time. There it was, clear as day, her name, her date of birth, her insurance details. The procedure, listed as a nephrectomy, dated 3 years earlier. The diagnosis, ambiguous, described as risk of infection due to anomaly. The justification was vague, almost lazy. But the consent form was pristine. Her name, her signature, a checkbox for patient understands and agrees to the removal of the left kidney. It looked identical to her handwriting. Her pulse raced as she studied the page. Something felt off. She flipped through more records, reading every note scribbled in the margins, every doctor's observation. Then she noticed it, the pre-op evaluation form had been filled out by a physician she had never met. His notes described a consultation with her, a conversation she had no memory of. The physical exam, vitals check, and verbal consent were all noted as completed. The signatures matched those on other legitimate forms. But she hadn't seen this doctor. She hadn't had this conversation. She had no memory of it because it hadn't happened. She photocopied every page and left the hospital in a daze. Back at home, she sat on the floor again with the document spread out before her, cross-referencing the timeline with her own calendar and phone history from that period. She hadn't even been in the city for part of the week they claimed she'd been in pre-op. That week, she had gone to visit her sister upstate, something she confirmed with photos and old messages. Yet the documents said otherwise. According to the hospital, she had undergone a full preoperative assessment, signed multiple consent forms, and checked into a private room under observation, all while being somewhere else entirely. The implications settled into her bones like ice. Her signature had been forged. Her identity used without permission. The surgery had been orchestrated and carried out under a false narrative. And the hospital, whether knowingly or not, had facilitated it. She dug deeper into the file, scanning doctor names, nurse initials, timestamps. One nurse appeared on several of the notes. She searched her name online and discovered that this woman no longer worked at the hospital. She had transferred to a private clinic 6 months after the surgery. It felt like another dead end. But she made a call anyway, posing as someone seeking consultation. To her surprise, the nurse picked up. What began as a casual inquiry quickly turned into a subtle interrogation. The nurse confirmed she remembered working at the hospital during that time. When asked about the doctor listed on the consent forms, she grew hesitant. She said he had left the hospital shortly after that period and that there had been some internal review issues that she wasn't at liberty to discuss. Her tone shifted after that, guarded, clipped. She ended the call quickly. But even that small admission was enough. There had been something wrong. She wasn't imagining it. She returned to the hospital the next day and asked to speak with a supervisor in patient records. She showed her ID again, this time more assertively, and explained the discrepancies she had found. The woman behind the desk grew visibly uncomfortable, glanced at the printed folder she carried, and said she would be right back. 15 minutes passed. Then a man appeared, middle-aged, stiff posture, a badge that read risk and compliance. He smiled thinly and invited her into a small conference room. She laid out the copies of her documents. She showed him the inconsistencies, the overlapping dates, the forged consent. She asked him point-blank, how had a major organ been removed from her body without her actual knowledge? He was quiet for a long time before responding. When he finally spoke, it was in the language of liability and protocols. He said the hospital would need to investigate. That mistakes like these, while rare, were taken seriously. That there may have been a miscommunication during the intake process. That legal counsel might reach out to her for clarification. He avoided the word crime. He avoided the word forgery. He avoided her eyes. She left the hospital feeling more hollow than before. The building that should have been a place of healing had become a fortress of denial. Behind its walls were the people who had failed her, who had altered her medical record, who had enabled someone, likely her own husband, to take something from her body that could never be given back. She knew now that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about systems. About loopholes. About how easily trust can be weaponized when no one is looking. She began building a case. Not just emotionally but factually. She scanned every document, compiled timelines, sought out medical professionals willing to give her unofficial assessments. What had been taken from her wasn't just a kidney. It was the right to know. The right to choose. And the more she learned, the more she realized how many people had stayed silent. How many had looked the other way. How many, maybe, still didn't know what they had been part of. The lie had been written in ink, notarized by bureaucracy, and buried in records meant to protect her. And yet, through persistence, she had unearthed it. But the truth came at a price. She would never get back what was lost. Her health, her peace of mind, her ability to trust, those had been compromised. But she had something else now, evidence. A paper trail. And the will to uncover every last person who had played a role in the theft of her body. the decision to pursue legal action wasn't immediate. At first, she was consumed by disbelief, then grief, then rage so quiet and cold it barely felt like anger at all. It was more like clarity, an undeniable understanding that what had happened to her wasn't just a betrayal, it was a violation of her body, her autonomy, her rights as a human being. And yet, as she stared at the neat stacks of evidence she had carefully assembled on her kitchen table, photocopies of hospital records, a calendar proving her physical absence during the alleged pre-op consultations, printouts of insurance claims she never filed, she knew evidence alone wasn't enough. If she wanted justice, she needed to challenge the very institutions that had conspired, whether actively or passively, to take something vital from her. The first lawyer she approached was skeptical. He listened carefully, nodding in the right places, but his eyes gave away his doubt. He said the case was complicated. Medical consent laws were murky. Hospitals had strong legal departments. Proving forgery would be difficult, and implicating her husband without direct proof could backfire. She left his office feeling defeated. But she didn't stop. She contacted another attorney, and then another, until finally she met someone who didn't look at her like she was delusional. This woman, a medical malpractice specialist with a reputation for litigating against hospitals, read through the documents in silence, then looked up with an expression that was equal parts concern and determination. She took the case. What followed was a whirlwind of legal activity. Her attorney began by issuing formal requests for the full medical history, including internal communications between hospital staff. Most were denied, citing privacy protections, but some were granted under patient access laws. They discovered discrepancies, dates altered subtly, digital timestamps that didn't match handwritten entries, forms added to her file months after the alleged surgery. Her legal team brought in forensic document examiners who analyzed the signature on the consent form. Their conclusion was unambiguous: it had been forged. Then came the insurance company. They had processed the nephrectomy claim 3 years ago without raising any flags. But when subpoenaed, they revealed that the authorization code had been submitted online through her patient portal, an access point she had never used. Her attorney cross-checked the IP address tied to the login. It matched the address of her home, her computer, her network. But as far as she remembered, her husband had full access to her devices at the time. It was a critical piece of circumstantial evidence, suggesting that someone with close access had impersonated her to facilitate the procedure. The picture was beginning to form, even if some of the strokes remained incomplete. The hospital responded aggressively. Their lawyers sent a cease and desist letter, claiming that the accusations were defamatory and that they had followed all necessary protocols. But behind the scenes, they were rattled. Internal memos were leaked through anonymous sources, documents showing that a quiet HR investigation had been launched the year following her surgery, triggered by an anonymous tip regarding irregular consent procedures. No action had been taken. The implicated staff members had either resigned or been quietly transferred. Her case was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern. Her lawyer filed the lawsuit. It named the hospital, several attending physicians, and John Doe placeholders for individuals yet to be identified, including, eventually, her husband. She knew this would burn everything down. Her marriage, her reputation in some circles, her sense of normalcy. But there was no turning back now. The suit alleged gross medical negligence, identity fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. It was explosive. The media caught wind of it within days. At first, she refused interviews. She didn't want to become a headline. But then she realized the story was already spreading, with or without her voice. Reporters began showing up outside her apartment. Talk shows speculated about the unnamed woman at the center of the stolen organ scandal. And then, one evening, she sat down in front of a camera with a small local station and told her story. No embellishments, no drama, just facts. Her voice was calm, deliberate, undeniable. The response was immediate. Thousands of women began sharing similar fears. Some even recounted eerily parallel stories: disappearances in medical records, unexplained surgeries, partners who controlled their medical decisions. Her case became a lightning rod for discussions about consent, medical accountability, and the invisibility of abuse in intimate relationships. Advocacy groups reached out. Petitions were launched. Even lawmakers began asking questions about how such a violation could pass through so many layers of oversight without intervention. As the hospital scrambled to contain the fallout, her husband disappeared from their apartment. He left a note, something vague and apologetic, more cowardly than contrite. She forwarded it to her attorney. A private investigator was hired to track his movements. It didn't take long to discover that he had withdrawn a significant amount of money months prior, stashing it in accounts she hadn't known existed. There were emails between him and a surgeon abroad, messages that suggested the kidney hadn't just been removed, but sold. With this, the case took a darker turn. It was no longer just about malpractice. It became a criminal investigation. Federal authorities were contacted. Her husband's passport was flagged. The hospital faced a second, parallel case, this time not civil, but criminal. She gave a deposition. Then another. She relived the betrayal 100 times in sterile rooms with fluorescent lights and men in suits scribbling notes. It was exhausting. But it was also empowering. With each retelling, she reclaimed a piece of herself. The legal process dragged on, as these things always do. Motions were filed. Court dates scheduled and postponed. Witnesses deposed. But the foundation of the case was unshakable. She had the evidence. She had the experts. She had the truth. And the institutions that had once silenced her were now being forced to answer. What began as a quiet suspicion during a job interview had become a national reckoning. She had no way of knowing how far it would go. Whether there would be convictions. Whether she would ever see justice in a courtroom. But she had done something far greater already. She had pulled back the curtain. She had shown the world what had been done to her, not in whispers, not in shame, but in full, blinding light. And that, in itself, was a revolution. Months passed. Seasons shifted in quiet succession. The leaves browned and fell, winter crept in and left again, and still the legal wheels turned slowly. But something inside her moved faster. Not away from the pain, but deeper into it. She was no longer seeking to outrun the truth, but to live alongside it. The silence that once echoed so loudly inside her body, the quiet absence of something that had been taken, no longer felt hollow. It had become space. Space to understand. Space to rebuild. Life after the revelations was not smooth, nor was it expected to be. There were days she felt invincible, and others when the weight of what had happened crushed her with new angles of grief she hadn't anticipated. The trauma did not ask permission to revisit her. It came at the most inconvenient moments, a glance in the mirror at the faded surgical scar, the hum of fluorescent lights in a doctor's office, the sound of a printer spitting out forms that reminded her of forged consents. But she had learned how to respond. Not with fear, but with presence. She changed her apartment. Not just redecorated, she gutted it of anything that had shared a life with him. The couch they once chose together was sold. Every picture frame emptied. The kitchen repainted, the locks changed. It wasn't about starting over. It was about reclaiming what was always hers. Even the act of buying new sheets felt like a declaration of autonomy. Her home had become a sanctuary for someone new, someone she had fought to become. The press attention faded eventually, as it always does. Headlines turned to newer scandals, louder tragedies. But the impact remained. Policy discussions were held in hospitals across the country about patient consent and procedural verification. She learned through her attorney that her case had been cited in academic conferences and legal journals. She had become an unnamed precedent, a ripple through systems that prided themselves on infallibility. It was surreal to know her most personal violation had become part of public discourse, but she didn't resent it. If anything, it was validation that her suffering had ignited change. She no longer expected a satisfying ending. Her husband was still out of reach. Extradition proceedings were in motion, but distant. He had left a trail of lies behind him, but little that could be used to recover what had been sold. The organ itself, her kidney, was gone. Likely transplanted into a stranger who would never know it had once belonged to someone who hadn't consented to give it. That part of the story would always remain incomplete. And she had made peace with that. Her health stabilized. Follow-up tests were frequent at first, then spaced out. One kidney meant new routines, stricter boundaries. She adjusted with discipline, not fear. Each morning she drank water with a mindfulness that once seemed trivial. Each checkup that passed without complication was a quiet victory. She found herself noticing small things more, the feel of her chest rising with breath, the way sunlight hit her skin on walks she took just to feel her feet move. She was alive. Not in a grand, triumphant way, but steadily, wholly, and with intention. Support came from unexpected places. A nurse who had once worked at the hospital reached out anonymously to thank her. Survivors of medical abuse wrote to her through her attorney, sometimes just to say they believed her. She never responded publicly. The journey had been hers alone, and she wanted to keep that part sacred. But she read every letter. Every word reminded her she had torn a hole through something carefully hidden, and light had poured through it. Financially, the case changed things. The hospital eventually settled. It wasn't public, and it wasn't everything she had hoped for in terms of justice, but it was something. Enough to pay legal fees, move cities, enroll in courses she had long postponed. She wasn't rich by any means, but she had bought herself time, and time had become her most valued currency. She used it wisely, choosing work she cared about, limiting who could access her life, investing in therapy that slowly helped her untangle years of silent manipulation. She did not forgive him. Not because she couldn't, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. What he did was unforgivable by any moral or legal standard. He had taken something physical, yes, but more than that, he had taken her trust, her agency, her right to say no. That was not hers to give, and it was never his to take. To forgive him would be to let him re-enter the architecture of her healing. And she had rebuilt herself without him. When she stood before a small group of women at a university panel almost a year later, she told her story again. It was the last time she planned to share it in public. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She spoke plainly, because the truth had never needed embellishment. It was already outrageous. Already incomprehensible. And yet, it had happened. The room was quiet when she finished. Some eyes were red. Others defiant. One woman approached her afterward and said, "I didn't know I was allowed to be angry." She simply nodded. Because that was the whole point. In the mirror now, she sees a body with a missing part, but she does not feel incomplete. What was stolen from her will never return. But what she built in its absence is something far greater. She no longer wakes up wondering why or how. She no longer searches for closure. She has instead chosen clarity, strength, and a kind of joy that doesn't depend on justice but grows from survival. She only has one kidney. But she lives with no regrets.